Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a single, pretty provocative source, the essay The Leftist Paradox by OLAVO de Carvalho. Our goal here is to simply walk through his argument, step by step, to understand his controversial thesis from his point of view. So right from the get-go, the author hits us with this really powerful claim. He's not just saying that this ideology shapes people's views. No, he's arguing it goes way deeper than that. He suggests it actually creates a kind of parallel world, a whole separate reality that, according to him, disconnects its followers from what's actually happening around them. All right, so here's the game plan for breaking this all down. We're going to start with what he calls the core paradox. Then we'll look at his critique of historical leaders, explore why he calls this whole thing grotesque, not tragic. Then we'll get into the self-defeating consequences he points to, his strategy of asymmetric warfare, and we'll wrap up with his final big provocation. Let's jump in. Okay, first up, the core paradox. This is really the foundation of his whole argument. He's saying there's a fundamental contradiction, something he calls a contradiction in being, right at the heart of this worldview. So you might think the argument is about some future utopia that just never showed up. But for the author, that's not the point at all. He says the real issue is a kind of present-day falsification. It's this idea that the ideology doesn't just promise a different future, it actively twists and distorts a person's reality right here, right now, influencing pretty much everything they think and do. All right, on to our second point, a critique of the leaders themselves. Now, the author doesn't just leave this as some vague, abstract idea. He tries to pin it down by creating a psychological profile of some of history's most famous revolutionary figures. And, this is where he makes some really bold claims. He basically characterizes figures like Marx and Lenin as, and this is his language, emotionally deficient personal failures. He paints this picture of people who, because they couldn't really manage a normal family or economic life, basically compensated by creating this huge, grandiose self-image of themselves as a superior revolutionary type. And here's the crucial step in his argument. He claims this personal lifestyle, this coping mechanism, doesn't just stay personal. It gets blown up and projected onto all of society. Suddenly, it's transformed into a whole system of ethical duties that, in his view, start to dictate how everyone should live, from family structure to what's taught in schools. Okay, next up, the grotesque, not tragic. And this is a really interesting part of his argument. He makes a big deal about how we should frame the failures of these movements. He says calling them tragic is completely missing the point. For him, the right word is grotesque. He draws a super sharp line in the sand here. A tragedy is about a noble hero who fails fighting against impossible odds, right? But he says that's not what happened here. In his view, these leaders failed a basic, elementary intellectual duty. They failed to see the glaring holes in their own ideas. And he blames that failure on things like vanity, pride, and cowardice. And that, to him, isn't tragic at all. It's grotesque. And this quote from the text just hammers that point home. It says, "There is no tragedy in the failure of socialism. There is only a bloody clown show." He completely refuses to see any kind of nobility in the movement's failures. He uses this original Portuguese phrase, palhaçada sangrenta, which really translates to a bloody clown show, just brutal. This leads us right into the real heart of his paradox, what he calls the self-defeating consequences. The core of his argument here is that historically, these policies have achieved the exact opposite of what they claimed they wanted to do. So let's look at his first example, the paradox of plenty. The stated goal was to end misery and poverty, right? But the author points to things like the forced collectivization of agriculture in places like the Soviet Union and China and claims the direct result wasn't plenty, but mass famine that killed millions. Then there's what he calls the paradox of safety. He argues that a major goal was to protect leftists from their enemies. But then he claims the unbelievable result was that leftist leaders, think Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, ended up executing more of their own followers than pretty much any right-wing regime in history. And his third example is the paradox of peace. The goal, pacifism. But the author claims that these movements actually ended up enabling war. He gives a couple of examples. First, he points to pacifist movements in 1930s Europe, which he argues just gave aggressors a green light. And then he points to the end of the Vietnam War, claiming the calls for peace ultimately led to a violent takeover and slaughter. So the big question is, how does this pattern continue today? Well, according to the author, it's not just random chance. He argues it's crystallized into a very specific modern strategy, one he labels asymmetric warfare. So, what is this asymmetric warfare? In his view, it's essentially a psychological trick designed to turn military or political defeats into moral victories. The core idea is that the two sides are playing by completely different rules. One side is given, like, a moral free pass to do whatever it takes, while the other side is totally disarmed by these paralyzing moral demands. And he breaks down the logic like this. Step 1. You grant one side total moral permission to do anything. Step 2. You hold the other side to impossibly high ethical standards. Naturally, the side without any moral restraints gains a huge strategic advantage. But here's the real twist in his logic. He says the strategy itself is proof of malice, because it only works if you're targeting a victim who actually has a conscience and can be paralyzed by guilt. Now, the author is quick to point out that this isn't some brand new invention. He claims it's really just an old rule of thumb from the Leninist tradition that perfectly sums up the whole strategy. And that rule is, accuse them of what you do, curse them for what you are. Okay, so to take this out of the realm of pure theory, he offers up a real-world example, his take on the media coverage of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. What he argues here is that you can see a massive double standard at play. He claims that when there are accidental civilian deaths on one side, it's condemned across the board as a monstrous crime. But at the same time, he alleges that when the other side deliberately targets civilians, it's often celebrated as a heroic act. And for him, this is a textbook case of those asymmetric moral demands in action. Which brings us to his final point, his ultimate provocation. After all of this, what's the deep philosophical root cause that he thinks ties this entire paradoxical system together? Well, his final point is that all of this, from the personal psychology of the leaders to the modern military strategy, stems from one single thing: a foundational hatred of reality. It's this Gnostic dream, as he puts it, of magically transforming the world, not by working with it, but by trying to completely erase it and start over out of sheer will. So there you have it. We've just distilled one author's pretty complex and, let's be honest, controversial critique. He's presented this whole theory of ideological self-destruction, and it really leaves us with a huge question to think about. What does this all suggest about the relationship between any movement's stated ideals and its actual real-world actions? How do we even begin to understand the gap that can sometimes open up between noble intentions and actual outcomes?